Quindi
So I think we can start. A warm welcome to everyone, both those here in Venice and those following us remotely. I don't know why I hear a second voice. So today's talk is organized by NICHE, the Center for Environmental Humanities at Foscari University of Venice. For those who don't know me yet, my name is Cristina Baldacci. I'm an associate professor in history of contemporary art at the Department of Philosophy and Cultural Heritage and an affiliated faculty with NICHE, where I lead the Ecological Art Practices Research Cluster and the Art Ecologies series, of which this event is part. This event is also part of NICHE's new book series. It is my great privilege to introduce today's guest speaker, Giovanni Aloi. An author, curator, and educator, he teaches at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and also a member of the Ecological Art Practices Research Cluster at NICHE. So Giovanni is one of the leading international voices in the field of art history as it relates to critical plant studies, as evidenced by his numerous publications on the subject, including the wonderful book, I have a copy here if we want to circulate it, that we are presenting today, which bears the highly evocative title, Botanical Revolutions, How Plants Change the Course of Art. So before we explore together with Giovanni the significant and fascinating influence that plants have had on the evolution of materials, techniques, and media, forms and content in art throughout the centuries, I would like to highlight some of his other key writings, the themes of which are echoed in his latest book, this one. First of all, the collection of essays, Why Look at Plants? The Botanical Emergence in Contemporary Art, and the monograph Lucian Freud Herbarium, both released in 2019. These are followed in 2023 by the edited books Vegetal Entwinements in Philosophy and Art, a reader, co-edited with Michael Marder, and Estado Vegetal, Performance and Plant Thinking, a collection of interdisciplinary essays on Manuela Infante's award-winning play Estado Vegetal, which explore the relationship between critical plant studies and performance in the Anthropocene. So I would like to point out that Estado Vegetal is part of the Art After Nature book series, published by the University of Minnesota Press, of which Giovanni is co-editor alongside Caroline Picard. So, and last but not least, also published in 2025 as Botanical Revolutions, the book entitled Lawn, which brilliantly explores our passion for cultivated lawns, revealing the deep colonial and capitalist ties that underpin it, as well as the multiple ideological and ecological layers that over time have come to shape our conception of nature. Finally, I would also like to mention two of our most recent collaborations, Giovanni. The article that you wrote in the form of an intriguing conversation with Monica Gagliano, as many of you might already know, an ecologist who studies plant intelligence, for the recently published special issue on art and ecology of the Italian academic journal Uomo Nero, which I co-edited, and then the special issue on archives and contemporary art that Giovanni and I are co-editing for Antenne, the Journal of Nature and Visual Culture. So Giovanni founded Antenne as an independent peer-reviewed journal in 2006, so 20 years ago, and has been leading this publishing project with great dedication as editor-in-chief ever since. So a very important, also critical tool, let's say, beside your academic job as well. So without further ado, please help me in welcoming Giovanni. Thank you for being here with us in the Venice.
Thank you all, and thank you, Cristina, for the wonderful introduction. It's such a pleasure to be here. I mean, I was born in Milan a long time ago, and I've been living abroad for quite a long time now, almost 20 years in the UK and 12 years in the US. And it's always a pleasure to come back here. And that's one of the things that's beautiful about working in the arts, is that coming back home always means something else, right? There's always a good excuse and multiple reasons why it makes sense to come home a lot. So today I'm going to talk to you about Botanical Revolutions. And I think it's beautiful that Christina's invited me to give this presentation, because Cristina has invested so much of her research, thinking, and time on ecology, and hopefully we'll have an opportunity to converse a little bit at the end of the presentation, and then I look forward to your questions as well and thoughts on plants. How many plant lovers do I have in the room? Good. What's it like to grow plants in Venice? Right? Challenges. Right? Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I agree. And I love the gardens of Venice, the small gardens. There are plenty of them, the private ones, but also the small pockets of green, like some of the parks, which is incredible. So plants persevere even when there seems to be no chance that they will. Botanical Revolutions is, like Cristina explained, the sum of my research in the field of ecology, plants, and animals over the past, I think I have to update now, 25 years. Every time, it gets more and more. And it is also a book that takes on art history as a discipline, because I was raised an art historian, and as you grow and grow as an art historian, you realize how complex the subject is and how many blind spots it has. And we're all familiar with the blind spots related to gender and race when it comes to art history, but many of you, I'm sure, know that art history has also been blind to nature for a long while, and definitely to plants. So that's where Botanical Revolutions comes from. The necessity to set the record straight, and also to apply some posthumanist beliefs to art history. I think art history needs a lot of ecology. And when I say that, it's not just in the subject, it's in the way it looks at the world, right? Art history needs to kind of reconfigure the priorities and the hierarchies, especially. So I'm going to explain to you what I did. In a sense, I do look at Botanical Revolutions as an alternative art history book for plant lovers. And it brings plants back to center stage where they belong, while art history pushed them in the background. It's a book published by Getty, and it was essential for me to work with a publisher that has access to an extensive archive of images, because it is a highly illustrated book. And it was very interesting for me as well to research through their archives and learn more about where plants appeared and art history ignored their appearance, but also where they were absent at the same time altogether. And it's a book with a kind of global scope. So I've also tried to fix a little bit that blind spot of art history where the West is consistently central. And it is a book that although it's not organized chronologically in the strictest sense, does something with chronology that I think it's still important. It plays with it. Every chapter has its own internal chronology, and then the structure of the book advances in time so that modern and contemporary art appear towards the end of the book nonetheless, because I think it's still useful to help the reader in understanding how past experiences and experimentations ultimately influence what we do today. So what I want to do today is to focus a little bit on some of my books, some of the books on screen. These are the ones that have populated and informed the work on Botanical Revolutions. But what I want to do is to navigate us through part of the structure of the book and then focus on some important themes that I address in the book. So I just don't want to tell you what happens in every chapter exclusively, but to focus on key thematics that I think are really important when it comes to plants in contemporary art especially. So just to give you a little overview, this is the table of contents of the book. So you can see how, like I said earlier, there's a kind of loose chronological structure to the book, key moments. In a sense, the book captures the moments in which plants have helped artists generate new styles, movements, trajectories, either in medium making or style making. So there's determination to really like bring up to the surface the contribution of plants in art, something that art history, of course, is disinterested in. So briefly wanted to start from this point that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, the idea of anthropocentric miseducation, which I kind of like as a title of a potential book, maybe another one. But we have all been miseducated, right? We've been miseducated at school, we've been miseducated just in everyday life, we're miseducated by the media all the time, we've been miseducated by art to assume that we are central to everything that happens on this planet. I always use this Raphael's fresco as an exemplification of humanism and the philosophical moment that during the Renaissance centered the human in such a way that ultimately led us to climate change, but it also leads us to the levels of blindness that we experience all the time when it comes to nature. We are intrinsically nature blind, more in general. And as you can see here in this beautiful fresco, there's an absence of nature. The architecture is classical, it's invented, it's fantastical, but at the same time, it's void of any plants or animals. And of course, there's a gender complication here too. There's only one woman in the mix, it's Hypatia of Alexandria. And there are no people of color either in the scene. So it captures really in a nutshell, in a sense, the beauty and the horror of humanism that led us to the anthropocentric miseducation that I'm talking to you about right now. So I follow this thread of the anthropocentric miseducation across cultures in what became chapter 1 of the book. And I outline a peculiar contingency that in Western art, transforming into a plant is essentially a negative thing. It's a diminishing of the human. You're all familiar with Apollo and Daphne from Ovid's Metamorphoses. And there are a number of passages describing this beautiful scene that's been sculpted by Bernini in such an incredible way, in which it appears clear that the moment Daphne is transformed into a laurel tree, Apollo loses interest in her. Yet, he makes her the emblem of himself. So the laurel becomes the symbol of Apollo. And in that, I find this oddly patriarchal subjugation. There's objectification first, and then a subjugation connected to this appropriation of the plant symbol that's being created as a form of escape. And when we look at other cultures, like for instance, Aztec culture, we find that transforming into a plant is actually a bettering. It's actually something positive. And I looked at the story of Mayahuel from ancient Aztec mythology, who transformed into an agave. to escape, once again, a relative who wanted to destroy her because she was jealous of her lover that we see here in this image on the left. And when we look at an agave plant, the spines at the end of each leaves are one last form of protection from the desire of destruction of this relative. And we know that from agave, the Aztec culture drew pulque, which is a ritualistically important drink. And at the same time, the agave plant is a giving plant. It's very generous. It provides fibers for rope making, for clothing, for tools, and many other resources. So it's interesting to focus on other instances in which turning into a plant is actually beneficial and actually enriches everyone's world. And then, of course, in Australia, in Aboriginal art, plants are not depicted as beautiful objects to collect and archive. This word has come up a couple of times. But they're actually part of a continuum. So the idea of the lack of separation between the plant body and the human body, and this flow between different realities connected by narratives. So the work of Aboriginal artists are maps, as you can see, of the land, and as maps of the land, they connect plants to humans, animals, and the soil. And I think this is where, in a sense, in Western culture, we have lost, we have been miseducated. We have lost our understanding of how important plants are. And while in the West we have these histories of separation from plants, other cultures have nurtured histories of coming together. So in chapter 2, I focus on something that I think it's very interesting to those of us who spend a lot of time either writing books or reading them. But the idea that knowledge comes hand in hand with plants on a conceptual and a material standpoint. It is a little bit of a commonplace, I guess, that when papyrus was invented, clearly it helped us archiving information and clearly boosted the way in which we produced mythologies and passed on information to one another. But I think there's something more interesting to the invention of sheets of material upon which we could write, like papyrus, that also altered the way we think. For those of you who write, you know how writing is thinking, right? That's why I love writing so much. That's why I wrote so many books, is because to me it's an opportunity to test my thinking against reality. And every time I write, I discover something that I didn't know I was going to write. I follow the words and I follow the chapter where it leads me. I have a sense of where it might lead, but then there are surprises all along. And I think the page in and of itself, or the scroll, are places that couldn't happen without vegetal fiber and its flexibility. So papyrus was a first step towards not only recording information, which is usually what history has placed a strong emphasis upon, but expanding our brain. The more we can write and the more we can reread what we write, the more our brain can expand to bigger and more complex concepts. So the same, of course, happens when paper was invented in 105 AD, and the, again, flexibility of fibers through the mulberry tree becomes so central to the expansion of our skills as writers, but also our thinking. There is this work that I'm particularly fond of, and I think, in a sense, it gives me a little insight into what a true art history devoted to plants could do. And that wasn't what I set out to do when I wrote the book. So it was a bit of a surprise to think about a work of art this way. I'm going to tell you how in a second. Because I had never thought about a work of art this way, just because I've not been trained this way. I've been miseducated by art history. So when I was looking at this work of art, I realized that this is all about plants from a representational standpoint, but also materially. So the paper is made of mulberry, once again. The ink that you see here, the black ink, is made of pine that's been charred and turned into ink. The representation of itself, of the plant we see here, is an orchid. And then I became curious about the poem. And I love the proximity, the material and aesthetic proximity between the poem and the plant, how that poem tries to get as close as possible to that leaf, so to trace or come into harmony with the vegetal being. It's ancient, so the translation, I asked a number of scholars, and three slightly different translations came in, where they emphasized how it's the quality of the writing that actually makes it very difficult to understand and translate the meaning into English. And it's along the lines of after winter is over, the orchid leaves are not particularly appealing, but the scent of the flower continues to float in the air. So I found that extremely evocative. This is a work of art that it's evoking through the poem the scent of plants, which is something that's remained completely alien to the archiving of botany in the West. So every time we archive plants in the West, we archive their bodies and turn them into these brown, leathery, emblems of what they were, and we miss out on such an important part of the plant itself. Not a critique, I mean, like what's possible, it's possible, and what isn't, isn't, but it's good to be aware of that the Western archives of plants are hugely incomplete in a way or another, and that other cultures have also attempted to try in a way or another to bring these elements back. Chapter 3, I continue this investigation on the expansion of knowledge through plants, and of course I focus on the very early herbals, extremely important plants in the sense that they also created the collusion between words and images. There were only a few illustrated books before herbals became so popular during the Middle Ages. The Bestiarium was one of the most popular illustrated books. And once again, we have this synergy between plants and words, because you have to find these medicinal plants and you need to see what they look like. And some of the drawings really probably didn't help very much. But again, I very much enjoyed seeing how authors really focused on the possibility of aligning words with the vegetal form. There's a poetic sense of proximity that I explore in these examples, and follow the ways in which artists over time greatly contributed to the history of botany. This is an Italian marvel. I never get tired. I think I'm becoming the ambassador of Gerardo Cibo abroad. If you haven't heard of Gerardo Cibo, find out more about his incredible representation of plants in the book by Andrea Mattioli. The innovation here is that finally plants become central subjects, dominating the landscape, elevated like a sacred apparition. And the connection with the landscape is ecological. So we're here in the 1500s, and an artist is already laying the foundations of what will become so central to the 1700s, the 1800s, and moreover, so last century. The idea that where the plant is collected, the weather, the climate, the people that work on that plant by harvesting it or growing it, this ecological connectivity is present in these beautiful illustrations, and it's just a mind-blowing book. The other thing I care to point at is that art history always tells us that realism returns at this time in Western representation because of the revival of classical philosophy and art. However, the attention and observation that plants require at this time, it's also instrumental to this desire to look more carefully. So there's a much more rich and complex history of botany and the return of realism in Renaissance art that I talk about in the book. Other interesting example, like Wan Dosheng, who ended up in trouble as a woman artist painting bamboo in a non-traditional way, and therefore breaking the rules and starting off a new school of representation of plants. The idea again that women at the time were only allowed in China, Japan, and Korea to paint orchids and butterflies. while bamboo was a masculine, patriarchal symbol. Therefore, you can see why she broke the rules in such incredible way. And perhaps the hardest artist to research in the book is an artist called Su Shi, whose work has actually not survived to us. And so I'm showing you here the work of another artist who also painted bamboo in red. You can probably imagine why it's very hard to research an artist called Su Shi, especially in archives. All you get is sushi and lots of menus and pictures of sushi rolls. Even in library, you get recipe books. And the revolution with sushi dates back to 1037 AD, and he painted bamboo in red, breaking the rules that it should be painted in black. And when his colleagues disagreed, he engaged in a long argument about the realism or abstraction in Chinese painting. And because of that, he was pushed out of the court and could never paint again. It was believed at the time that bamboo should be only painted in black. So you can see how plants are central to turning points in the history of world art in ways that I have found extremely fascinating. In chapter 4, I explore the history of colonialism and the representation of plants through the very well-known tulip mania that I'm sure you are familiar with. The innovation here is based on the aesthetic of the white background and the individual specimen outlined in the utmost clarity. This style was emerging already in botany, but it's through the increased interest in the trading of tulips that it becomes a very much focused and recurrent approach to the representation of plants. This is a catalog. So it was designed to buy and sell tulip bulbs. And so the clarity, the extraction of the bulb from its landscape happens almost like naturally because these are cultivars. And it's one of the first moments in the history of botany where cultivars also become central to the representation of plants in a scientific context. We're very familiar with these, right? The still life paintings of the 18th century, which might lead somebody to assume that there was actually a moment in the history of art where plants did take center stage. And we can argue that to a degree, maybe that is right. But what I argue in the book is that unfortunately, these beautiful still lives betray plants because they invite us to look at plants with a lot of intensity, but these paintings are all highly symbolic. And the symbolism is anthropocentric. These paintings were loaded with Christian symbolism, every flower symbolizing a virtue or something to fear. And therefore, what I argue in the book is that these paintings of flowers ask us to look at flowers as vehicles, not as subjects. And the very moment we look at a flower, we should instead envision the purity of the Madonna or the brevity of life, the intensity of love. There's so many meanings ingrained in these representations that have nothing to do with plants. I also talk in the book about more benevolent, if you like, forms of symbolism that don't smother plants completely, as we tended to do in the West. Of course, there's a whole chapter on architecture and design. I guess that's to be expected. And one of the things I learned that I was very fascinated by in this case is the history of acanthus, which is a plant I am particularly fond of. You probably know that acanthus ends up becoming the emblem of classical art around the world. The Corinthian capital is what we see everywhere in so many architectural monuments and buildings. And it is a symbol of rebirth because of a story linked to Callimachus, who designed the capital, who saw an acanthus plant growing from underneath a basket that was left on a grave of a young girl. And the basket contained some toys. It was a votive offering. And the maid that placed the basket by the grave laid a tile on top of it so that the toys wouldn't get ruined when it rained. And apparently Callimachus returned in the spring and saw the leaves of the acanthus growing, wrapping the basket, and loved the aesthetic and rushed to the workshop to create the most famous classical capital of all times. So this idea of rebirth that runs through the architectural design was also extremely popular in eastern parts of the world, like in Southeast Asia and India, and it was combined with representation of Buddha that I found particularly enlightening. And you know, I studied art history in Italy, like many of you, but we're talking about the 80s and the 90s at this point. So things I'm sure have changed. And I then furthered my studies in London. And I had never come across either parts of the story, the actual meaning of the acanthus leaf, and then how the acanthus leaf was actually not the emblem of Western culture all along or throughout time, but that it has a much more diverse history. As we move up in time, there's a whole chapter dedicated to the impact plants had on photography. It's like it's not very much talked about how the flatness of plants really helped early experimenters of photography capture the first photograms, because you can lay the plant onto the photographic plate and capture its silhouette in extreme clarity. Once again, we have a woman artist who was erased from the art history book. Anna Atkins created the first photographic book in the history of the world using plants and creating these beautiful cyanotypes in a limited edition of British algae as well as ferns. The alliance between plants and photography continues with the invention of autochrome by the Lumiere brothers. And autochrome was made using potato starch. So once again, we have plants contributing to the actual medium in ways that are very unique and unprecedented, but also the coloration itself. You will remember that towards the end of the 19th century, photography was still struggling to capture color in a naturalistic way. So autochrome was advertised using flowers because the Lumiere brothers said, go out in your gardens and take pictures of your plants. This is the first time you can really capture their colors. So you find that the very medium itself and the invention of this medium harnesses the beauty of plants in order to create a new excitement for this medium. And the last chapter looks at how modern and contemporary artists have really started to make us closer, come closer to plants. Having to grapple with the heritage of classical art history, I cannot avoid the sacred monsters of art, Western art. And I have a soft spot for Monet, I have to say, because art history has done a really bad job with Monet at diminishing his love for plants and emphasizing too much his love for color. So oftentimes the water lilies, for instance, are talked about as this triumph of coloration and the brushwork and the expression of the dynamism of it. And instead, if you dig a little deeper, not in art history books, you will find information about Monet being extremely devoted to water lilies. He painted water lilies exclusively in his pond in Giverny. He dug the pond in Giverny himself with the help of 5 gardeners, and then proceeded to divert the flow of a nearby river to bring the water to it. This is like true determination. Initially, he wanted to work with lotus flowers because of his interest in Zen philosophy, but the lotus flowers were dying every winter. So he was told to try water lilies. And he wasn't particularly excited about that because water lilies at the time were only white. However, a nursery southwest of Paris called La Tour Marillac, you can still visit today, it's still active, were hybridizing flowers, water lily flowers from Northern Africa with the ones from South America and creating new colors. So the orange, blue, and yellow that you see in the water lilies are all new hybrid varieties that Monet was in love with. And he did say multiple times that the garden is his greatest work of art. But to me, in the book, the most important aspect of the water lilies is not just that, of course, this is a portal to abstraction, right? Plants gave us abstraction. That is the argument I make in this chapter. And there are many artists who looked at plants and ended up departing from our world. To him, water lilies are, I think, more of an opportunity to reconnect with the harmony and beauty of nature. They're not just this desire to explore light and color like it was with the haystack and the wheat stacks. I think there's something much more spiritual going on that is very important to what is happening today with plants. Hilma af Klint, another artist who was erased from the art history book. I do a pretty fair kind of like, gather in those of you who have been sidelined in this book, but it's a pleasure, of course. And Hilma af Klint, again, looks at plants in order to think more carefully about the essence of life and find a connection. I very much love this theme about reconnecting. There's clearly a sense of alienation that runs through the whole of the history of Western art. And these artists are trying to reconnect us, save us from our plant blindness, heal us from the miseducation of art history. And Hilma af Klint started from botanical illustration of a classical kind and ends up painting a birch this way. I mean, like, what else? It's really turned her inquiry in the botanical world has turned into a question of energies and auras rather than the representation of plant itself. There's a whole history of modern art where plants are central that has been erased by art history. I look at Matisse and look how happy he is with his monstera. That monstera was in his studio and it's enormous. I actually wanted to include a different photograph in the book, but we couldn't find in the archive, we couldn't find where it lives, probably only online at this point, but it shows the plant in its entirety, and it's a monument in and of itself. But then we like to include this one because he looks so happy, right? Happy with his plant. And you can see how the monstera informed Matisse's interest for the cutouts, the collages he made towards the end of his life, and how the monstera supplies him with these forms of marine and natural life that don't exist anywhere specifically and yet are essentially connective. They're about harmony, they're about meditation, they're about being present, right? These are the values these artists really treasured. So now I'm going to take you through, having run through literally the main chapters of the book. I want to break down the last chapter into some themes that maybe we will find more productive. And of course, one that's very dear to me is objectification. I don't know why, when I was working on animals, probably because I was interested in taxidermy and natural history and I wanted to break that down, objectification became a big paradigm for me to explore. And I was interested in this question that I'm still interested in. At what point can you bring a plant into the gallery space or museum space and not turn it into an object? And I explore different examples in this chapter, but this I'm particularly keen to show because I think this is a crime. Like, art history should really own up to its crimes. This is probably one of the worst. Erasing. I just felt bad that I discovered this work only 10 years ago. And I studied art history in different countries. And this, to me, is the equivalent, the plant equivalent of Duchamp's urinal. You all know the fountain, right? Which is highly celebrated. You cannot publish an art history book without a chapter on Duchamp and the urinal, because otherwise it would be the end of the world. But this is nowhere. And it happened at MoMA in New York. Now, I can understand if this happened in a tiny museum in, I don't know, Pittsburgh, and it was only on for a week. No, this is MoMA. And all you could find up until recently was the press release for the show on the MoMA website and 3 photographs. It's only recently that a book has been published, and you can find it now. You can buy it now. It's literally been published. I haven't read it yet because it's published like this month. And there's an exhibition based on this work at the Eastman Museum in the US. So what is it? Delphiniums that Edward Steichen, who was very accomplished as a photographer at that time, grew and hybridized himself so that they became gigantic. You can see that these delphiniums are like 6 feet tall. What's 6 feet? Is it like 1 meter and a bit, right? So probably more than that, meter and a half, I think, right? Yeah, a meter and a half. So they're very tall delphiniums. And the question that Steichen was posing by bringing this live plants, even if they're cut, as you can see, these flowers, was what is a work of art? Why is a painting of a flower art, but a flower that's being manipulated by an artist is not considered to be art? And isn't it, maybe is it not art? Maybe because it cannot be sold, because it cannot be archived. Why do we stick in the 1930s to very old conceptions of what constitutes an artwork and what doesn't? So, to me, this is exactly the set of questions that were posed by Duchamp in 1917. But what Steichen does is that he brings the living into the equation and he lays the foundations of what today we call bioart. So, it totally needs to be reinstated into the traditional art history book as a very powerful moment. Then I look, of course, at Cassatt and a lesser known, I'm sure all of you know One and Three Chairs, but he also did One and Three Plants, right? Which is not included in the art history book most often because it's deemed less important. But I don't have the time right now to get deeply into this, but as you know, the piece, even like the one involved in the chair, is about semiotics, perception, and the way in which we organize knowledge and create meaning. And in this case, what I found interesting is that he staged One and Three plants with different species of plants all the time. So again, maybe a case of plant blindness where he saw no difference between a palm, a ficus, a cactus. So you can read my considerations about that in the book. Elio Itisika, the nightmare of 1960s and 70s curators, all the way actually to the 80s and 90s, he started using potted plants, and potted plants contaminate environments, right? When you bring them inside the museum, there's creatures in the soil, they can have parasites that will eat a Monet. So bringing in plants, living plants, potted plants for Tropicalia, which is a seminal installation, to me is really meaningful. Again, these are works of art that in the art history book have presence, like Tropicalia is definitely there, but not because of the plant. So in my book, I try to bring the plant forward and try to think why the plant is there. Why couldn't it be made of plastic? It's part of the meaning of the work. Otisika is making a political critique of how Brazil is perceived from Europe and the rest of the world as a non-problematic holiday destination. So the potted plants have to be live. They have to be this symbol of the mobilization of life that happens in forcible ways as well. There's a colonial blueprint that it's connected to these pots as well. Then I look at identity. These are like Cristina was saying, like the book really emerges from these questions that I have explored throughout my other works. At what point can we say that artists help us to construct conceptions of identity when it comes to plants, right? Plants are multiples. Plants don't seem to necessarily have what it takes to class as individuals. Well, in this book, I argue otherwise, through the paintings of Lucian Freud, for instance, who cared for his plants the way you see here. He didn't prune them, clean them, tidy them up. He believed that a plant should be allowed to express its individual character through ruination and dead leaves. So this is intentional. He never cleaned off one of his plants. And at that point, as I wrote my book, Lucian Freud Herbarium, and I spoke to his family members to piece together a theory of Lucian Freud and plants, it became clear that plants can be individuals, but that we constantly push that individuality back because we subscribe to classical ideas of beauty in our everyday life that usually don't appreciate a yellowing leaf because it reminds us of death. So we rush to pull it off. And by pulling it off, we erase bit by bit the identity of the plant itself. So I became interested in other artists who like scars and blemishes. And I find the amazing work of Lee Kwang-ho, a Korean painter. Just imagine that the painting you're seeing on screen is actually twice as big as what you're seeing on screen. So these are monumental portraits of cacti in which the artist, as you can see, registers every blemish, every mark, every moment in the history of a cactus. Do I have a cactus lover in the room? Oh, good. Now, if you're a cactus lover, you know that once a cactus scars, it scars. You can't heal it. And it will preserve that scar forever. Instead of looking at that scar as a negative blemish or a flaw, Li Kuang-ho values it as part of the history of that cactus. It's a lived life. It means the cactus has been in the world, hence it has a scar, and it is to be celebrated, not to be ashamed of. There's also marginalization that it's extremely important when it comes to plants in contemporary art. You probably are familiar with artists who have been working with weeds over the past 2 decades, especially. Zachary Logan paints weeds in ditches as an emblem of queer communities that have been marginalized and pushed aside by mainstream culture and yet thrive in the absence of attention. Chicago-based artist Jean Lee photographs weeds in the alleys of Chicago. Chicago has an alley system behind homes that keeps the city very clean. Every time visitors come to Chicago, they marvel at how clean it is in comparison to New York. And in these alleys, there's an ecology of weeds that grows pretty much undisturbed because people don't care about cleaning the alleys. And through the artist, these beautiful weeds that have a bit of a durer kind of quality represent resilience. We can find in plants opportunities to think about resistance and survival, right? How do weeds persist against adversity with very little, just like some of us, some groups, some individuals do the same? This installation by Linda Tagg and Baracco Wright, some of you might remember, was here in Venice at the Architecture Biennale of 2018, representing Australia, brought back native plants from Australia into temporary containers made of felt. And it was the artists and architects' wish to play with that flickering between the erasure of indigenous people and the erasure of the landscape, which both come hand in hand. We know how indigenous people used to care for the land, and their demise also meant the demise of the land itself. And architects Baracco Wright, in their architectural creations, devise opportunities for us to reconnect with the land and native species as well. Another artist worth of note working with indigenous plants that are considered weed is Mona Caron, who makes this incredible murals which are representatives of spontaneous plants. She only paints indigenous species. This is Joe Pye, and it's in New Jersey. You can see it from the southern tip of Manhattan, and it's a big political statement just made by one plant. Joe Pye is a medicinal plant that's very important to indigenous people in the Midwest of the United States. Of course, it's been pushed back because of urbanization and because the settlers didn't like it. But it represents quite clearly a resurgence of indigenous knowledge and a proposition to reconnect again with these histories. And she's really created an herbarium of murals around the world that are extremely, extremely imposing and accessible. I think that's the other thing that's important about her work. Now we have two more categories before we can converse. And diasporas is, of course, very important. Plants pretty much go wherever they want, and they have the tendency to do so. We are the ones with the problem. We like to keep them put, but they don't comply. And there's a number of artists who have really invested a lot of time and research in foregrounding this idea that perhaps we should be thinking more readily about the fluidity of movement of plants in our relations as well among ourselves and the land. This is a work by a pioneer artist called Lois Wayne Berger, who allowed weeds to grow on an unused track at the station, at a train station. And what happened here is that it created an ecosystem all of a sudden. And some species were deliberately native of Germany, while others were coming from other parts of the world. And the train station makes particular sense for him. It was about people coming and going. You know, stations are places of transition, and these plants represented an ecosystemic balance that can be achieved through those transitions. Maria Teresa Alves and her project Seeds of Change, which works recovering ballast seeds. So again, Maria Teresa Alves focuses on this idea that plants migrate, sometimes with us, sometimes on their own. And when colonial ships traveled from one continent to another, they would bring soil as ballast and offload it into other territories. And that created a major cross-pollination of plants around the world. So she researches where these sites are in ports around the world and then allows a small ballast garden to flourish with all these species coming from different continents together in that place. Otobon Kanga, exploring the challenges that migrants face when they move to a different country. These performers carry on their heads nightshade jasmine, which is not a jasmine, but it's actually a solanum plant. So she plays with this idea that a plant that it's meant to be a species that's desired, actually turns out to be a species that is not desired, and therefore tries to reflect the flickering of how migrants are sometimes welcome and then sometimes not. She also envisions this idea of migration as a dance, as you can see with the lines on the ground, trajectories and movements that people explore like plants. Some settle, some grow, some take, some don't. Very quickly now, Eddie Rodolfo Aparicio casting the bark of plants that are earmarked for destruction in California because they were introduced from South America. You can see the sub narratives of migration again. They were introduced during the 1940s and 50s because they grew fast, like the ceiba tree and the ficus tree, and they created shadows and shade for the city. And now they're undesirable because they break the concrete and have grown too fast, so are being eradicated. You can see how Eddie Rodolfo Aparicio makes casts of these beautiful skins to preserve the scars and the lived lives of these trees that, of course, speak of the migrants who also came to California to build the state and are no longer desired. At times, he incorporates discarded clothes from these communities after they are pushed forcibly out of the neighborhoods that they have inhabited until recently. And we have to close with cosmologies, of course, plants and ecologies. Another work, you see, when I talk about being back in Venice is always good. This was exhibited at the Venice Biennale of 2022, and it was the last chapter of the Arsenale. So if you visited the exhibition at that time, this was the last thing you'd see. And it was the installation of Precious Okoyomon, a Nigerian American artist who works with kudzu and sugarcane, created an installation that is simultaneously post-apocalyptic or prehistoric, in which the species occupy a very prominent place in the world. Both species have been, again, forcibly imported to the United States. They didn't come to the United States out of their own migration, natural migration, and they enriched the country until they became undesirable. There's more of the story of these plants that we can discuss maybe during the Q&A if you want to hear more, but I'm very keen just to wrap up with Rashid Johnson, who just had a massive exhibition at the Guggenheim in New York, in which he exhibited many of these structures that you see here involving potted plants and busts made of shea butter, as well as shavings of black soap. And this is, to me, a really interesting chapter in the history of plants and contemporary engagement with plants. And of course, there are many other aspects of plants that I explore in the book. But Rashid Johnson looks at potted plants as a symbol of those communities that need our assistance. Because as you know, potted plants are extremely vulnerable. They depend on our watering. And to him, they represent those in our communities who don't speak as plants don't. And that we need to look at in order to read the signs of their vulnerability before the symptoms become too degraded. So I hope that this gives you an idea of what I do with the book and try to form an overview with depth, I'd say. I go into depth quite a bit with every example, but my desire really was to foreground a phenomenon that also over the past 20 years has really become more and more important and more popular. The idea that artists want to engage with plants so much more than before. And I think because artists and art historians are engaging with plants more than ever before, this book, I hope, will be helpful to kind of like trace the histories that have led us where we are today. Thank you.
Thank you, Giovanni, so much for this beautiful presentation that, let's say, gives us the idea of the richness of the book. And I have to say that I really enjoyed reading it because it gives us an historical perspective and a theoretical perspective, as you just saw even from the from the presentation, but also it is finally in our contemporary world, and also let's say all the limits, let's say, of the paper publishing of today, a book with a lot of images. So somehow you extended with this book the discourse you introduced and analyzed in your chapter 3. So this important relationship between words and images. And I will maybe, let's say, make a couple of questions, and then we can just break the ice, and then we can open up the discussion. My first question would be exactly on how this book was born. So how, let's say, it's a kind, I would say, if not an archive, which is not, but an atlas. Mm-hmm. So with a lot of images that create a kind of montage, one after the other, and many different connections and paths, a conceptual path, yep, and so on. And so it's really enjoyable reading it because, yes, you have history, theory, and then a lot of images, which in every image takes with it histories, mm-hmm, no? Histories and specific, of course, also contents. And so it's really a book that opens up a lot of different parcours and paths. And so you told us that you did also a lot of research in the Getty archives. Mm-hmm. So, but you told me also that just a few of the images you chose came from that archive. So there is also a lot of searching, of course, and knowing, and in your study about artworks and also new discoveries like this one by Steichen, which is great. And so how did the images, let's say, helped you in building, mm-hmm, not just the structure of the book, but really the way in which you wrote the book?
Yeah.
You know?
That's a great question. I don't know how many of you want to be art historians or are art historians already? Nobody good. I think it's probably wise.
Very interdisciplinary group here.
Yeah, stay away from art history is really complicated when it comes to making books. And I think only art historians know really how complicated. That's hence Christina's question. When you have an idea for a book, the first question art historians worry about is where are the images? Can I get them? How much are they going to cost? Right. So in this case, as I said earlier in the introduction, it was essential to work with a publisher like Getty that also owns a massive archive, because this book could have been potentially extremely prohibitively expensive to the point that it would have made no sense to make it. It actually isn't very expensive to buy, which is very important to me because I believe in accessibility. It could have been like $200 or $150, which I didn't want to do. But I think what's really interesting about your question, Cristina, is, like I was saying earlier, writing leads you places, right? You have an idea of what you want to write, you have a thought, you have a strategy, you have a trajectory. I always like map my chapters with special moments. I think I need to talk about this, I need to talk about that, then I see the flow. But then something happens and you find yourself learning and discovering as we go. With the images, you need to clear the copyright before that process happens. So you're always stuck between this tension that you want to allow the writing to be as free as possible, but then there is no point in writing about a work for which you're not going to be able to have an image, right? You have to have this dialogue between words and images in a book. So it was extremely complicated because it's a very, I can't remember how many images we have. And what happened actually is that in the contract, Getty asked me to sign that 80% of images should have come from the Getty archive. And at some point I just said, I can't. I looked at the archive very carefully and we miss more. That there's more that you don't have that I absolutely need. And they were totally accommodating. I said, okay, well, how many more do we need to buy? But it's a super complicated process. And sometimes, I have a folder with all the scraps. Every art historian, yeah, I have a folder with scraps of text that didn't go in the book because a complication with an image that initially we thought was within reach turns out to be a nightmare. I actually would say, none of you wants to be art historians, right? Picture researcher, another nightmare. I don't know, it sounds fascinating, but I see them doing incredible work that it's extremely frustrating because tracking down these images, even today, in this time and age where you think AI will do it all, it doesn't. And picture researchers really lose their minds over, because they know as well that if they cannot find an image, then it takes the book elsewhere. It's not a little thing.
So if we consider that the book is a 200 pages book, and every single page has at least one image or two, so yeah, it's an easy count. You have more or less 250 images here. And so, well done. We know how difficult it is, but really when you read, it's as I said, it's a visual essay, and that's very rare because of course, in exhibition catalogs, you have this, but very differently. But there are many levels of reading. So you read the text, and then you look at the image, and then you examine in the image what you just wrote, and then you think about something else. So it's a continuing looking at the images and reading the text, and it's really a wonderful way to let's say to go in deep into the argument. So
yes.
Another question for you is that, so since we are in Venice, so you spoke about a lot about weeds as not just a symbol of resilience, but also a plant that is resilient in specific ecosystems. And in Venice, we don't have so many weeds, but we have, let's say, as plant of resilience, algae, no? So let's say, the water plants. So have you ever jumped into algae in your studies and as, let's say, plants of resilience?
Just sort of touched on I guess the moment where that would be surfacing in the book is with Anna Atkins. And, algae as well, depending on what species or category you're working with, can blur the boundary between plant, the category of plant, and the category of something else. So we decided with my editor to stay as far as possible out of the waters and to focus on a conception of plants that also made sense of the critical plant studies focus in terms of subject, which is in a sense more terrestrial and more anchored. But I have to say, I have a collection of pictures of Venice weeds, which now actually reminds me I would like to share at some point on social media. They're really pretty. Like when you look at walls, they come out of walls in Venice because there really isn't much soil open to, contamination and like colonization. So I find it very sweet that they come out from like between bricks and they seem to flourish so much. It's definitely a different weed category, even more perhaps because they're dealing with salty water in the air and fascinating.
Yes, as you might imagine, in Venice there are a lot of artists, curators, and also researchers who are studying algae and, of course, in connection with the city, with environmental change, and with resilience as well. So maybe a new chapter or a new.
Why not?
Why not? So I'd like now to open up the discussion. So feel free to ask some question, even from via Zoom from home. So raise your hand or write your question in the chat, because it would be nice to have also a participation of the many of you who followed. So who wants to break the ice from the audience? Comments? Yeah. Yes, please, so everybody hears you.
Okay, so thank you, first of all. I come here as an intruder because I'm not history of art, nothing. Okay.
Yeah.
Because I do 15th century literature.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And
intruder.
Yeah, very much. And I wanted to ask, because I study texts from right before where we started today, right before what we called the anthropocentric
miseducation.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask you, is there anything before that that developed as an alternative way, particularly in the West, because I'm doing the West, and which then didn't make it to the main discourse, but was there?
Are you thinking about formats, styles, genres, physical?
Theory.
Well, I'm thinking more specifically what I found interesting in terms of illustration and the gathering of information in a format that resembles an archive or a book. In Southeast Asia, different cultures would make portable books, very small, like this, or sometimes smaller, using palm leaves. And they were bound together in a quite fascinating way so that you could turn, so they would be like very horizontal and elongated. And those sometimes had little illustrations as well. So there's a synergy there again between illustrations and words. But I think the really interesting aspect of what happens with the medicinal books is that when they employ images, they do so in order to create truth. That's the thing that I found important about my process and the research in focusing on those books. It's not just about creating a reference that you can look for in the woods, but I think there's something much more important in the alignment and the alliance between words and images, where it's like doubling down on truth. It's really about confirming that what the words are saying are, what the words are saying is connected to reality. And in a sense, of course, 1500 books or 1600 books could not anticipate the invention of photography. But when the first photographic books emerged towards the end of the 19th century, in which writing, Anna Atkins doesn't have writing next to the images. There's an introduction, but then the plates are just illustrative plates. But towards the end of the 19th century, when early books begin to circulate with photographic plates, that is really the dream, I think, of the original authors from the end of the Middle Ages and the early Renaissance, is to be able to show very clearly that what these words are saying is proved by an indexical trace, a real evidence. So I think that would be the theoretical trace to research before the appearance of images. How is truth constructed in the most convincing of ways in these books that have an early scientific ambition and yet still navigate a very open and loose territory?
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I also really loved your illumination of these early manuscripts of like Aurelius and also Gerardo Cibo, and this kind of alignment of the text and the vegetal form, and it was quite eye-opening to me, actually. I mean, kind of retrospectively, I can also, think about these texts, but it sort of posits an interesting tension or contradiction with, say, the Netherlandish still life paintings, which, as you said, it's a kind of symbolic language of these flowers, and also this impossible temporality, and how they kind of compressed. I mean, they were, in a way, an analogy or a kind of language of colonial control to like in an age of like expanding global empire, and I actually I mean, around 2 decades ago, I did a performance at the Kunsthistorisches Museum where I worked with different gardeners and horticulturalists to bring together that vegetation in a still life by Bruegel, and quite quickly, realized the impossibility of bringing these different seasoned vegetation flourishings together.
Right.
And somehow, I mean, in the end, what the performance was a distillation of a still life. So actually creating a distillation from these plants, which was drunk. So it was also kind of a sensorical kind of
Interesting.
illusion, but eluding of, the kind of taxonomic, encyclopedic herbarium form. But I don't know, I just perhaps wanted to speak to that sort of the question of temporality and that.
Yeah. That's a great question, and I'd love to see your work. I am becoming more and more interested in that question of presence, temporality, and attunement with plants. I explored some of it during my writing for Lucian Freud Herbarium, because Lucian Freud only painted his potted plants in the house mostly. There's only a few exceptions. And when I spoke to his family members to try and piece together, Lucian Freud passed away in 2011. And so when I spoke to them to try and piece together this image of like a Lucian Freud plant lover, how does that work? And they were like, not in that classical sense, but he loved these plants. So what emerged was that he was not the plant lover of today where, people worry and fuss around their plants. But to him, looking very keenly and focusing on things was apparently the most important thing connected to accessing truth and reality. So we're going back to truth as a big thing here. Lucian Freud believed that by staring at something with a certain intensity, you could get to a layer beneath the surface. And all of his body of work from the 1950s onward is grounded in that conviction that through keen observation, you can extract something of the actual character of someone or a plant or an animal that otherwise remains elusive. So I became more interested in that notion of spending time with your plant because Lucian Freud was a very slow painter and he would therefore spend a lot of time copying and interpreting every detail. And that's what his family members, you know, like his daughter, Annie, and other people who were very close to him emphasized. It's like he loved them in the sense that he loved to spend an enormity of time with them and just be there, flowing through time and capturing what he saw. So whenever he painted a plant, like his very famous painting called Two Plants, which is a Tate Britain, captures an aspidistra and an Helichrysum petulare that he had in the studio for 3 years. And I talk about that painting in the book. It's painted copying the plant every day or so, but without ever going back to correct it. So it keeps painting what he sees at that point that day. And he had to come to that conclusion that that was the best thing to do because there was no point in altering the temporality of the painting. So what usually doesn't get acknowledged by classical art historical inquiries is that temporality. To me, that painting is mind-blowing because photography and film can't capture that. Every day, it just like continued 2 or 3 leaves that represent that specific day. And so there's a question, I think, that is more central to contemporary art. What does it mean to align yourself with the temporality of a plant, to attune yourself with that being here together, rather than, as you pointed out, the Dutch Golden Age compositions, which are extractivist in essence, colonialist in approach, and they're impossible. They're impossible dreams collaged from other artists' paintings and from sketches. And the one thing I actually love about those paintings now, I've always loved them, but then you go like, oh wow, there's all this like symbolism, is how really those artists were incredibly gifted at harmonizing every single flower with light, because they make it look, the illusion that those flowers were at one time in front of our eyes is outstanding. And I always think that they didn't have spotlights like we do, switch it on, switch it off. They had to paint with natural lighting, candles, all the limitations they had, and yet light creates that illusion of a temporality that could never be manifested. And it's kind of leading me to spiritual / religious considerations we don't need to go into, but it's fascinating, right?
Yeah, very fascinating. And when you show us Lucian Freud's painting, I was just thinking how much his painting was close to neue Sachlichkeit, new objectivity, no? And this is very linked to what you were just saying. And maybe we can consider new objectivity a kind of proto-new materialism, at least
To a degree, yes.
in art. I see that there is one raised hand in the in via Zoom. So Noemi.
Hello,
Hi,
everyone.
Noemi.
Can you hear me?
Ciao.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the inspiring presentation, this overview. So my question is actually about another, actually, this very much known genre in art history, which is landscape. So I was wondering, my question is, how much your book relate and say something about the contested at the moment genre of landscape? And connected with this question is also, in your book, it seems that the scale is much more kind of zoom, obviously, on different plants compared to the bigger scale of the landscape. But how you have struggled of not transforming the book in a kind of botanical garden?
Would that be a bad thing or a good thing?
Well, depends which garden we are thinking of. If we
Right,
think about
yes.
the Victorian age garden, there was a lot of control, and the topic, like this focus was very much on the individual, but not on the connection of the plants. So I was wondering how you try in the book also to be able to connect the individuality without obviously objectifying, which is another topic you have actually bring on the table.
So There's a whole section of the book, or let's say a whole category aligned to the ones that we explored at the end that I couldn't get into right now for a number of reasons related to time and space. But I talk about artists like Frances Whitehead, who in Chicago has rehabbed disused gas stations from derelict, abandoned, and polluted lands and turned them into gardens for the community where people can come together and learn about plants that operate on the level of phytoremediation. So these are species that have the ability to extract pollutants from the soil and can be harvested and then disposed of or processed by companies that can extract those materials, some of which are really useful because we're thinking about heavy metals, and therefore regenerating land in urban realities. So there's definitely in the book multiple examples based on this. I also talk about Mel Chin, who did a pioneering event in the 90s, building a garden in which he was testing phytoremediation. Phytoremediation is something I'm very interested in. Talk about Andrea Conte here in Italy, who also works with ferns and phytoremediation. And in his case, back to your question specifically about the landscape, one of the notions that's been very interesting to me, because I am a gardener as well, is how can we build a garden where the starting point is not aesthetics? Because it's always been the case, right? The beautiful colors, the beautiful foliage, the pattern, the textures. And Andrea Conte made multiple gardens in the gallery space setting based on the phytoremediation property. So we grow, he grows plants that specifically can benefit the soil, and that's the choice that leads the selection of plants. I think that that's really interesting, and it makes me wonder what would our gardens look like if instead of starting from the color of flowers, leaves, demeanor of the plant, height and shortness, we started from analyzing the soil and focusing on which pollinators come to the land, which animals thrive in the soil, and then choose the plants starting from that perspective. I think that would be a really interesting garden of the now. I know there's an artist, Alexandra Daisy Ginsberg, who's been working with gardens that are created in collaboration with AI. And she's basically crafted an algorithm that can select plants and patterns of planting based on the preferences of pollinators and the restrictions of your landscape. So like whatever your garden is, if it's north facing, south facing, shadowed by trees or full sun, it will require different plants. So you can input online on her website, Pollinators Patchmaker, I think it's the name of the project. And the website will generate a plan for your garden. You can input the size of your garden, the like lighting conditions, and to the artist, it's a way of sharing the work that she does with institutions around the world who commission her to create a garden for a specific site. But she also empowers people around the world for free, you can make that for free, to create their own artwork garden, which is designed based on pollinators' needs. So there are different options there that I think can also inspire people everywhere to look at their gardens, for as small as it can be, to just do something different. Because personally, I'm also fond of the history of gardening in the West and everywhere else. I think it's a really wonderful sort of expressions, cultural expression. But there should be space for more now. It's not so much about eradicating what we have, but it's about reclaiming what's been ruined and repurposing our interest, reorienting our interest in a way that it's quite radical, no pun intended, thinking about others first. So I think that there's actually a posthuman sort of question embedded into the garden of the future and how we can build a garden of the future if we begin thinking from the soil, the creatures that live there, the chemical balance. Like, for instance, it's so hard to start there for amateur gardeners. You know, it's usually how much light or shade you get and whether you have a clay soil or not, just because clay is really difficult to handle, but not because of its chemical qualities or. And so looping this back to your question about the book, there were a number of parameters that were very important to me, which of course I hope I reflected well across the book, but diversity was certainly one of the parameters. And there's a question of aesthetics. When you work with a publisher like Getty that has a broad reach, they want these books to look beautiful. And contemporary art usually poses a challenge to that. And I have to say, once again, they have been very supportive and very open. I have never been under pressure to make the book look prettier than it was. But it was definitely on my mind as I started to venture past the 1950s that some of the images, weren't quite aligning. And I worked with a publisher in the past where actually we couldn't publish the book together anymore because they wanted me to stop the chronology at the 1920s. And I was like, why? Because they just wanted to avoid any aesthetic friction. I said, but you can't just stop a narrative of this. It wasn't this book. It was another book that still hasn't been published for that reason. But I find it extremely complicated when pressures to aestheticize, which are very strong all the time, take over the content and might produce a truncated book when, I'm still an art historian who specializes in modern and contemporary art. So it's a little problematic. But thank you for the really interesting question.
Thank you very much.
So let me add shortly that there are artists who showed also that gardening can be a form of resistance. No,
Yes.
so from in the 20th century, Hannah Höch, the Dadaist artist, so a form of political resistance against Nazism, to Derek Jarman, a form of personal resistance against illness and death as well. No, so this is also interesting to bear in mind in the discourse. And
you might be happy to know I'm writing a whole book about them.
Ecco. Now you told me.
Yes, it's almost finished.
Almost finished.
Yes, almost finished.
He's a quick writer, and a wonderful writer as well. So I see there are two questions in the chat. So Yves and Anne-Laure, do you want to make the questions on your own? Shall I read them? I'm going to read them. So Eve is asking, as a scholar of art history, the framework of critical plant studies is still quite new, but something I'm just beginning to engage with in the book project I'm working on in Japanese post-war painting. I wonder if there are any pushbacks you have encountered by scholars in the field, and what are some of these conversations?
Yes. Well, there's something interesting. Thank you for the question. I think there's something interesting about how we can forget when we surround ourselves with like-minded colleagues or just generally encounter quite regularly others who are drawn to the topic, because obviously they are very engaged and interested in the subject. But there is a lot of resistance out there. I haven't encountered it quite as much directly, but there's skepticism towards the tendency that we have to give plants more relevance. Some claim that it's a way of diminishing the human, and it isn't. It's just a way of acknowledging that plants have done so much more for us. And I find that surprising, but then I think about the challenges feminist artists or art historians are still facing today. And like you pointed out quite rightly, critical plant studies is relatively new. I just wish that weren't the case, but those of us who work in this field are still marginalized to a certain degree or frowned upon by art historians who consider themselves to be doing proper art history. I'm like, I've never been interested in really doing proper art history. I'm attracted by the quirky, the strange, the marginalized, the odd, you know, and it's it's what it is though. It's about resistance. We have to persist like weeds in the face of normativity.
So thank you so much, Eve says. So and Laure asks, hello, and first of all, hello, and thank you very much for the presentation. I was wondering if you came across any interesting and recent examples in contemporary art of plants approached solely for their biological reality, or are they still mainly presented in relation to humans and as a tools for metaphors and sublimation?
That's interesting. I don't know what biological qualities might necessarily entail here in this case. I'm thinking about artists who will work with plant intelligence, like Celeste Boursier Monginot, you know, exploiting, enhancing the capabilities of plants to be in places that they can't normally be by moving themselves on platforms on wheels. That was the Venice Biennale of 2015. So there's also Spela Petric, who works with plants' behavior. So if we can think about that as a biological dimension, I think in a sense it might fit. We have that kind of interest for what can plants do, how can they think, how can they learn. Memory and plants is a relatively strong area right now, I think. So there's Diana Scherer working with plant intelligence, with grass patterning, like exploring how roots move as intelligent parts of the body of plants. There's definitely a general interest in plant intelligence. If that classes as a biological dimension, I know that there are a number of anthropologists, especially cross-disciplinary anthropologists, who are working with plants that are relevant on the psychotropic kind of dimension for indigenous knowledge and indigenous rituals. A number of people are working on South American plants in that context, which are some of the most, I think, important because of the long lasting ability the relationship between plants and indigenous people has had to really craft cultures that have been not documented well enough. So I hope that answered the question. But I think there was an interesting point being made too, that whether the aesthetic is still driving, right? And I think to a degree that's an interesting proposition, because I feel like plants are beautiful, and it's very difficult to escape that beauty and again not start there. So back to, I guess, another biological dimension would be the garden, the phytoremediation gardens that I've talked about. And again, the challenge is probably there as well when we think about our relationship with plants, which plants we want to work with as artists, or which plants we want to write about, to be wary of that easy predisposition, right? That we see a beautiful plant is, oh, I want to write about this, or I want to work with this. While perhaps one of the most important things critical plant studies can do, it's also to reconfigure the hierarchy. More questions here.
That's okay. Yeah, no, just quickly, two things. As you were talking, I was thinking, yeah, definitely, I feel that there's been a significant shift in aesthetic appreciation of, say, unwanted, quote unquote, plants such as weeds. And is that perhaps also because of, you know, the way these have been, you know, foregrounded in contemporary art practice in the last few decades? Yeah, I'm thinking also in regards to, like, these vegetations that are rogue, that traverse the enclosure of a garden, so to speak. And just to ask perhaps a provocative question, but should we uphold the enclosure of the garden? Because ultimately it is a containment, it is something that is conducted and orchestrated, if you will. And I'm thinking here of like, certain people who, like, of course, within a kind of horticultural activism to like Gilles Clement and this idea of the third landscape, I think it was. But yeah, just do we need to dwell within the realm of the garden because it does conjure a kind of enclosure and containment?
Amazing questions. I love this.
May I add something on this because I think it's quite on the line.
Sure.
So talking about gardens, but also about still, I think, giving plants a kind of aesthetics, but also some kind of very positive values right now, instead of maybe looking at them as they are. So just striving to evolve and exist in the sense that we now, I think, kind of give them this idea of resistance, resilience. Instead, maybe they're just colonizing the place. Where I mean, there can also be another kind of reading that we can to that. But I don't know, but maybe also from the selections that you gave, it seems that, and I'm asking if that's true, there is this kind of romanticizing tendency also towards plants and their behaviors.
Yes. So, wow. I wish we had another hour just to answer both of these together. It's really, really interesting. Back to the garden. A lot of what I have come to realize about my relationship with gardening is based on my gardening. And gardening around Chicago is complicated because there's actually a lot of creatures, which is great, but that's why you find yourself. So there's a lot of creatures here. And we have like squirrels, which now are everywhere in Europe as well. But there's moles in the ground. When I lived in London, my garden was not as active as the garden I had. There's bunnies in Chicago hop around. Now, people think about Chicago and they think about this kind of towers like into the sky, but it's not. That's just the heart of the city. The rest is like a big village. Lots of gardens everywhere. In fact, it used to be called the city in the garden for that reason. So in my other book, Lawn, which, if you've got nothing to do, people enjoy reading it in about 2 days. It's a small book as part of the series published by Bloomsbury called Object Lessons. And at the end of the book, I had to tackle that very question because I feel like the garden with its enclosure has this political imperative that we might want to challenge. Also, what I noticed in the US, much more than in London or the UK in general, is that everyone is seriously addicted to the lawn. I know that probably here in Italy we're doing better with the lawn, but in the US, and I noticed too in Australia, parts of Africa, South America, the lawn has become this connective tissue in suburbia, and everything is a lawn. It's like somebody rolled this enormous carpet of silence and doom over the world. And it's boundaryless. And that's part of the issue, you see. So I just want to problematize the question of the boundary. I have a fence around my garden. Oh, the other thing I forgot to mention is deer. Like we get deer, not in the city. I'm just outside Chicago. I wanted a bigger garden, so I had to move out. And of course, with that came deer. Love deer. It's very like poetic and romantic when you look out the windows. Oh, look at the deer. Stay away from my tulips. They just like, they find the juiciest plant incredibly well. So the lawn has become the monstrosity that it is because of the lack of boundaries. Because your lawn goes into the lawn of your neighbor. And if you don't keep it, your neighbor gets upset. If you don't keep it trimmed, it has to look uniform across these properties for that reason. So you see how maybe a little barrier here would actually be better because everyone would have more power over their garden. I do, because mine is fenced. I cannot have deer coming in and destroying all my plants. But with that idea, actually, my garden was fenced by somebody else before me.
And I kept the fence because I don't want the gardens of my neighbors to suddenly become connected, because that opens up other issues of, you know, who's going to take care of this, who's going to take care of that. But the deer is the main reason. They can destroy everything. Now, the issue is, what do you do? Because I want the animals to be in the garden. And sometimes they rip everything up. You know, like bunnies love, you put a plant down, and bunnies love to go and nibble everything. Or you put a plant in the ground and a squirrel pulls it out all the time, every morning, the same plant, 20 times until there's nothing left. So I think as a gardener, you need to learn to embrace those collaborations for what they are. The animals were there first. This messing around we're doing is coming after. And I don't use chemicals, pesticides, and anything that can harm them. The previous owners had placed all these meshes at the base of the fence because the bunnies were digging under, and I took it all up. I'm like, come on now, it looks like a concentration camp. You could see it rolled up on the ground. It's really bad. So I think there's something to learn as you garden, is to accept like imperfection, to accept the animals will do their things and you have to let them do their things. And sometimes it's heartbreaking because you go and check on the lilies that were growing really well, but one bunny decided that I like to chew on these lily stems. The whole thing is gone. No lily this year. And it's just the way it is. That's become my philosophy. It's calming. It's still heartbreaking. I don't think you can overcome the heartbreak. But I think it's useful as a training for life itself. I think it's helped me to be more patient when, I don't want to say other animals. You know, when you're working on a book, you're working with so many people, or you're curating an exhibition, there's so many people, and somebody might unintentionally tamper with something that you put a lot of care in. And you try to kind of understand and remind yourself that it's part of the territory. It comes with the territory, and you have to negotiate that moment of disappointment in a different way. So I think that there's a very important lesson into accepting the garden as a fenced or unfenced reality, as a transitional space. And towards the end of the book, I'm going to tell you the ending of it, I actually advocate for a change in the contract of ownership of homes. I think we shouldn't own the garden as we own our homes. You can do whatever you want in your living room, bedroom, bathroom, change it to whatever style. But I think that the garden should be sold with a clear understanding that it doesn't just belong to us, but it still belongs to the animals and plants that are there. And so that you have a responsibility to care for it in a certain way. I know it sounds like, whoa, that's not going to go down well. And that's why you write books, right? You just you just fantasize sometimes about a different world that might exist or not. But I believe in that. I think when you gardening is first and foremost responsibility towards that land that you have. And you have to respect parts of what was there before. It's a compromise. You know, it shouldn't be a carpet of green grass. And to connect it to the continuation of the question, I think there's something interesting there about the romanticization. I talk a lot about the romanticization with Michael Marder. We see the situation eye to eye. Critical plant studies can easily fall victim of this romantic, you know, I don't want to name names, but the books about trees, and I can't say anything else. Otherwise, I'm just going to But there are many books out there that deliberately mobilize anthropomorphic imagery and distort scientific evidence in order to enthuse people. And to be honest with you, then I ask myself, what do I want? A world where nobody reads anything about plants because it's too scientifically dry and accurate? Or a world where people say in comments on Instagram, this book changed the way I look at trees. Now I can't help but walk in the forest and feel this connection with them. And then what do I do? Come in as like Gargamel and go like, well, it's not really like that. You know, you just kind of like find your place. Again, you go back to the garden and find your place of peace. But it is a problem because it's anthropomorphic. Again, it's about us. Once again, to me, what it does, I spoke about this in other books and essays. There's a deep problem with that romanticization because it obliterates diversity in the sense that we should train ourselves through our love for plants and animals to appreciate diversity more in general. And if all we're capable of is to impose on others the blueprint of who we are and like them only because they remind us of us or because we can find this area of, equality, then we are not doing right. I think we're creating a bigger problem. So that romanticization brings me back to romanticizations that smell of 1930s. There was a lot of romanticization going on there. It didn't lead to beautiful things. So it is something to be very aware of. I'm glad that you raised it.
So I think we can take one last question from the chat. So also because it comes from Argentina. So Tanya, hello. Thank you so much for your exposition. Who are your influences on plant philosophy in the post-Anthropocene view? Grateful from Argentina. And Tanya asks also, will your book be coming here in Argentina?
Well, you can buy it already in Argentina. Whether I will translate it, well, that's a work in progress too, that vexes art historians. So we're on it, you never know. Stay tuned. With the question related to influences, I like to treat artists and scholars exactly the same way. So I don't see a difference between a book by Michael Marder and a work by Precious Okoyeman. I think they are equally theoretically or philosophically valid as its forms of inspiration. And I have to say more influencing, I would say, definitely artists that have worked with weeds like Precious Okoyeman, Zachary Logan have been very important to my thinking on plants. Manuela Infante and the performance Estado Vegetal, which, by the way, you can find on YouTube. So when the book Estado Vegetal that I edited was published by University of Minnesota Press, Emanuela made very kindly a professional recording of the performance available to us as a companion to the book. And if you just search on YouTube for Manuela Infante, Estado Vegetal, it will come up. And it's mind-blowing. It's a crash course in critical plant studies, but also it extends. You see, that's why I look at artists and researchers with the same lens, because it extends and expands and problematizes philosophies of critical plant studies that came from specific texts, like, Marder, Emanuele Coccia, Monica Gagliano, Stefano Mancuso. And it takes those ideas to places that are new and exciting and that only art can question. So, yeah, there could be a more extended list, but the ones I've mentioned are definitely very interesting. But I also have a penchant for drawing into the critical plant studies field philosophers who never spoke about plants. There's a lot of Foucault that floats around Oh, Foucault is always there.
Is Benjamin also there? No,
Yeah.
sorry, I'm just joking. So, yes, do you have a question? Great. No,
But just
comment.
something. Just to let you know, Manuela Infante was invited in our festival, theater festival, a few years ago, and she presented a Metamorphosis. And I think it came in just in my mind. I listened to your presentation, how germinational is the way you think about plants in the arts. And then once Manuela started working on Metamorphosis, I think she was inspired very much about the work on plants.
Mhm.
And and at the same time, it was based on gender issues.
Yes.
So, and this is kind of a circular, very urgent movement in thinking we can gain by restarting from the plants and going back to gender and going back to plants and then going back to other critical
Correct,
issues of our critical agenda.
I really appreciate that point. I think that that's actually also why critical plant studies as well as animal studies matter, because every time it draws onto a broader area of concern that encompasses so much more. So I like the way you mapped it so well. I find my colleagues who are just interested in a specific sector now complicated, because I feel like they're missing out on this much more exciting ecological and cosmological understanding of every subject that we've studied 30 years ago is good and valid, but now it's becoming part of a tapestry of critical concern that is so much more urgent and meaningful if explored through the lenses that we have now.
So great. Thank you so much, Giovanni. Thank you so much to everybody who came and who also followed online, of course, and made wonderful questions. So you have to come back, Giovanni, very soon
Well, I'd be happy to.
present and discuss your gardening book.
Oh, yes, absolutely. I will. Thank you.
So we wait for you very soon again in Venice, and thank you again. So
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for coming. Thank you. La stranezza di Zoom, no? Le icone. Sì, sì, no, grazie mille. È stata registrata. Ah, ottimo. Quindi la mettete da qualche parte o... Ah, ottimo. Certo, certo. No, no, mi sembra molto... L'archivi.